Once upon a time, this was the first and the only Italian-style Renaissance classical building in London. It must have seemed to the Londoners who first witnessed it as if some great white spaceship had landed in the middle of their town from planet Europe. And if you really want to grasp the artistic genius that went into the making of this place, you really have to go inside. What do we see? 9 great canvases, decorated with all the brilliance, the splendor and the magnificence of the Baroque. Where does it come from? This aerial other world, Rubens' way of painting heaven. Charles I inherited this great space from his father, and it wasn't enough for him to be the possessor of the grandest classical piece of architecture ever constructed in the British Isles. So he hired an artist, Peter Paul Rubens, to give him 9 great canvases, and after 7 years they were installed on the ceiling. The massive pieces of carpentry that were involved in creating this ceiling. It turns out that when Rubens took his measurements, they were sent from England in English feet, but Flemish feet were different, as a result of which Rubens's pictures, they were all just a bit too big. So some of them had to be trimmed down, but more often the carpentry had to be expanded. The best way to see them, the best way to appreciate them, is to go up to that balcony at the top of the space. This is really the best place to get a sense of the structure of the scheme and a sense of its meaning, how it works. What do we see? 9 great canvases. Canvases so huge that Rubens couldn't actually paint them in his workshop. He had to move to the Carmelite monastery in Antwerp and do them there. One of the hardest things when you're looking at art from the distant past, one of the hardest things to understand and to really feel is how it would have struck people at the time. You've got to imagine yourself back into their shoes. Now, Charles and his court, we know they had no experience whatsoever, unless they'd been to Venice or Rome, and few of them had. They had no experience of this type of grand, Baroque, illusionistic art. They'd never seen anything like it in their lives. You know, where does it come from, this art? Essentially, Rubens is taking a grand tradition of aerial painting. It starts in its grandest form in Parma with Correggio's great ceiling for the dome of Parma Cathedral, in which we see the Virgin Mary being whooshed up to heaven. This astonishing vision, which astonished the people of Parma when it was done in the 16th century. Here we are in London, nearly 100 years later. Rubens is taking exactly that same language, Correggio's misty sense of an aerial other world, his way of painting heaven, and he's putting a real English king into it and having him, as it were, whirled round into it, surrounded by this amorphous bunch of putti who are whisking him up. We know, for example, from descriptions of Charles's courtiers going to see the plays that Inigo Jones designed, the theatrical stage designs that he made for them, all of which were calculated in mathematical perspective. They didn't understand what perspective was. They said, oh, he's put these flat boards on either side of people acting. They didn't see that the flat boards were actually arranged into perspective. So whether their eyes could actually understand this is already questionable. But my word, they must have been impressed by the overall effect. And you have to also remember that many times this space would have been experienced at night. It's a banqueting hall. It was meant for evening entertainments. So there would have been torch bearers up here, perhaps freestanding torches which would have been lit. There might have been quite a bit of smoke, but there would have been this, imagine the atmosphere, imagine the light flickering, imagine, the smoke playing around these already quite smoky pictures. The effect would have been beguiling, amazing, totally different. It would have felt like you were almost under a spell. It would have felt like Rubens was Prospero, and he'd put you all under a spell. Created this amazing mise en scène. Now, if you were to look at all these pictures and see them as a prophecy, which I think Charles I that's possibly exactly how you wanted us to see them. If you did that, then you would be forgiven for assuming that all was well in the British Isles. So if one's just going to go through the iconography of these pictures, because I think that's one of the hardest things for a modern viewer to understand. In the past, people immediately saw what these figures meant. They were used to this kind of allegorical language, whereas we're not. But at the far end, we've got James I depicted as a modern version of King Solomon, the ultimately virtuous and wise monarch. He's seated within a biblical architectural setting that has two large Solomonic, these barley sugar columns, again emphasizing his wisdom, his status as a new Solomon. He is the king as God. And that, I think, takes you to the heart of the scheme. It is an incredibly assertive confirmation of the idea of the divine right of kings, that the Stuart monarchy has been placed on the throne of England and Scotland to rule the people of these lands by God himself. And it's all reinforced by this heavenly imagery, these winged figures who descend from the heavens to crown James with the laurels of victory. It's all about victory and peace and wisdom. This is the Stuart monarchy apotheosized. I suppose the only element of modesty that we find in the whole thing is the fact that it's not Charles I himself who's being whizzed up to heaven or compared to Solomon, it's his father. This is a statement of his dynastic legitimacy. He's not quite saying, I am myself a small god to sit on my throne above all of you others. He's saying his father is that, but the implication is pretty clear. The central panel is the one where Rubens really pulls out all the stops in terms of absolutist monarchy and its symbols and attributes. At the middle of it all, we see James I being whizzed up to heaven. He's exchanging his earthly crown for the laurel of heavenly immortality. In terms of the Platonic philosophy of the time, this central panel represents what they thought of as the truth. I mean, what the monarchy thought of as the truth, namely that they were indeed appointed by God to rule, and once their rule was over, whizzed straight up to heaven. No purgatory, no waiting around, straight up. You take the elevator straight to the 1,000,000th floor. But it's not an elevator, of course. It is, in this case, his taxi ride is Jupiter, the eagle of the gods, who is going to carry him to heaven. A nice little mixing of classical and biblical mythology here, but you get the idea. One of the main themes of the paintings for the ceiling is the way in which the Stuart monarchy has brought, will bring, peace to this fractured British Isles, and that's above all expressed in the picture directly above me here, which is the depiction of James I uniting the two crowns, the crown of England and the crown of Scotland, because he is, of course, James I of England and James VI of Scotland, wearing parliamentary robes, which is in itself a little bit of an irony, given that Charles I had only just dissolved Parliament before these pictures were installed. But wearing parliamentary robes, he brings the two crowns together, unifies Britain. and sets off that sort of theme of peace, unity, harmony, concord, which is resoundingly reaffirmed in all these pictures on all sides. There is Minerva, wisdom slaying ignorance. There is Minerva again, subduing Mars. Wisdom subduing war. Can't help but be struck by the huge contrast between what the paintings are saying about the state of Great Britain and the actual state of the nation as it was during the years when these paintings were installed and first admired. My own favourite pieces of painting are not actually the great set piece images of James I. I love Hercules clubbing envy or rebellion. I mean, boy, don't show that to a radical or a revolutionary. That's the muscle behind the throne, as it were. That's like, well, don't you dare rise up against Charles I or James I, or this will happen. The most sort of innocent and exuberant parts of the ceiling are perhaps where Rubens himself is most unchained, because it's his own natural inclination. He was a great celebrator of naked bodies, fecundity, fertility, and it's the scenes of the putti. They sing the virtues of this new reign. Look at the putti bringing abundant fruit and vegetables to the people of the land. They remind me actually rather a lot of the wonderful choirs designed by Donatello, which are similarly these friezes of exuberant little babies, classical babies, putti, carrying garlands and torches. I'm sure Rubens knew those works by Donatello, and I think that's where he's absolutely at his best, in proclaiming the fertility of the land. Anything that one thinks about this space is naturally tempered by the fact that we know none of this was true, because we also know what happened next. In the 1630s, when Rubens was painting his great pictures for the ceiling of this space, Britain was in a state of chaos. Parliament had been dissolved. There was deep public unhappiness at the taxes imposed on his subjects by Charles I. He wasn't listening to anybody. Cromwell was round the corner. The Civil War was round the corner. And what was happening in this space? It's a theatre as well as a banqueting house. What's being performed is a royal masque, which is a theatrical entertainment with music, performed by the king, by 8 of his lords, his queen, Henrietta Maria, with only the court for audience. It lasts for about 3 hours. It celebrates the union of the 2 crowns, his perfect rule, the happiness of the people who, of course, are not here. The total cost in modern money, £4 million for 3 hours of the king's own private entertainment. Now, people often say it's ironic that in 1649, when Charles I finally met his end, was executed at the end of the Civil War, that it happened here. No irony about it, absolutely deliberate. Cromwell and his supporters wanted to make an example of Charles I, and they wanted to do it here, in the bubble of his autocratic power. They had him executed on a scaffold that took him from the bubble out into the street, where finally he had to face the ordinary people, the people who'd never been allowed into the great white spaceship. They watched as he had his head cut off. And what was the last thing that he did? The last thing that he did, he refused to pardon his own executioner for cutting off the head of God's rightful ruler. He still believed, as he looked up at that painting of his father being whisked up to heaven, he still believed that that was his own destiny, and that none of these people understood, and that the executioner was going to hell, but he was going to heaven. That was probably the last thing he ever saw.